The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to contribute to the discussion on Bill C-7, an act to amend the Public Service Labour Relations Act, the Public Service Labour Relations and Employment Board Act, and other acts. This act deals with the right of our brave men and women of the Red Surge to bargain collectively. This bill is a response to the Supreme Court's ruling last winter on the matter. The court gave the government a year from January 15 to implement a new collective bargaining regime for the RCMP. That deadline has since been extended. The ruling also indicated that it was the right of RCMP members to unionize based on Section 2D of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it found that the existing staff relations representative program was an insufficient guarantee of that freedom of association. I'm generally satisfied with the contents that are found within the confines of the bill itself. Let me tell you why. First of all, the bill does not require the RCMP to unionize. It creates a framework based on the existing certification laws under the public service employment legislation, whereby RCMP members can, if they so choose, form a union. Furthermore, it creates certain protections that are necessary in light of the unique nature of employment within a policing organization. First, the union must have a future prospective union must have as its primary mandate the representation of RCMP members. It cannot be affiliated with another bargaining agent or association that does not have that as its primary purpose. And it cannot be certified to represent any other group of employees. In other words, it would be an organization-wide bargaining unit represented by a single bargaining agent that would exclusively serve RCMP members and no other group of employees within the federal government. It's important because if RCMP members are going to be, if they're going to choose to be unionized, then that union should be of RCMP members, by RCMP members, and for RCMP members, Mr. Speaker, for it to be truly representative and appropriate for a police force. I'm very proud of the police force that we have serving nationwide. The RCMP headquarters is here in Ottawa, close to my home. I'm also very proud that we as Conservatives introduced legislation to help the RCMP better do its job and keep our streets safe from crime and terrorism. I should go on, though, to express that my satisfaction with certain other limits that exist within this proposed legislation so that we can protect the work of the National Police Force. For example, policies on law enforcement techniques, transfers, appointments, and promotions, disciplinary actions against RCMP members, and an RCMP officer's duty dress, equipment, and medals are rightly left to outside of the collective bargaining process and managed within the context of the RCMP Act. This bill does that. Next, the bill rightly increases the size of the Public Service Labour Relations and Employment Board from 10 to 12 and insists that the two additional members have a intimate knowledge of policing, so that when matters related to employment and labor relations within the RCMP come before the board, policing expertise will be found around the table. That is a reasonable proposal. Furthermore, as with most police organizations across the country, there will be, under this legislation, no right to strike for obvious reasons, because we need to protect our streets, even in the event of a dispute or an impasse in labor relations. We cannot afford to have our officers off the street and on strike. The government has rightly recognized this fact and embedded that reality in the bill itself. So the bill itself, Mr. Speaker, is reasonable and fair. However, it cannot be looked at in isolation. Simultaneous to this bill, our House and our Parliament are debating and discussing another bill that would strip the democratic rights of federally regulated workers across the country. C-4 bans workers, removes the right of a secret ballot vote from federally regulated workers in certain matters of certification. Now, it's important to be clear on what this means. It means that a union can take over a federally regulated workforce without there being a vote by the members who work in that workplace. In other words, thousands of employees from any number of federal employers could be forced to pay pay dues to and be represented by a union for which they never had a chance to cast a vote. This is particularly alarming when it relates to the RCMP, an organization comprised of members who put their lives on the line each and every day, in part to defend our democratic way of life. So it is a great irony that they, of all groups of employees, would be deprived the most basic democratic right, that is the right to vote in secret on whether or not to certify a union. The alternative to a secret ballot is a process called card check, where people go around, where those who want to take over a workplace and form a union go around with a petition, and they ask people to sign it. And then when they get 50% plus one of the employees to sign on, the board recognizes a majority and declares the union to be the bargaining agent. The obvious problem with that is intimidation. When one has to put one's name down on paper for all eyes to see, they risk being pressured unduly into favoring one side or another. It'd be the equivalent of holding our national elections by a show of hands. Could you imagine that? The government says that the previous Bill C-25, which empowered workers with a secret ballot, was undemocratic. They're in the process, this government is, of trying to change our electoral system. I wonder if they're simultaneously considering taking away the secret ballot from our general elections and replacing it with some sort of petition or show of hands. A card check, as it is called. The parliamentary secretary earlier cited a report from the Ministry of Employment showing that the statistical reality that if workers are given the right to vote, they are less inclined to choose unionization. In other words, unions are less capable, are not as formed at as high a rate when people are given a chance to vote on the question as they are when they are forced to sign a card check petition. Now, Mr. Speaker, the government's problem is with the outcome. The government might not be happy that when workers are given the choice through a democratic vote, they opt not to unionize. But that's the choice of the worker, not the choice of the government. It's obvious that rates of certification will go up if those doing the certifying are able to intimidate those they're trying to certify. Naturally, if they can show up on the doorsteps of the employee at 10 p.m. at night and ask them to sign a form and leave implied consequences for failing to do so, it is not surprising that under those circumstances, unions are able to certify at higher rates than when workers are given the chance to go into a voting booth and mark a secret ballot, exercising their true prerogative without anybody looking over their shoulder. But that is not evidence of why we should take away their right to vote. I mean, I wasn't particularly thrilled with the results of the last federal election, but I would never propose taking away the rights of Canadian voters to cast their ballot in secret as a result. Right. It's their choice how they vote. And I could probably produce some sort of study to show that in some aspect of Canadian life, things, voters will cast a ballot differently than my opinion if they're given a chance to vote secretly on the matter. That's not a reason to take away the secret ballot. Mr. Speaker, the fact that workers or anyone votes differently when they have the right to do so secretly than they would if they were being watched by an authority figure is of the very reason we need secret ballots. That is precisely the reason they were created. And they are a basic foundation not only of workplace democracy, but of Canadian democracy. And so I would call on the government to recognize that fact and amend this bill to ensure that the RCMP members will not be unionized without the right to vote on that unionization. In fact, Canadians agree with the right of secret ballot. It is basically in our democratic DNA. Secret ballot voting in order to certify union is not new or controversial. Ontario requires it. British Columbia requires it. You might have noticed that both of these provinces are currently represented by Liberal governments. Saskatchewan, Alberta, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland also require secret ballots, and none of them is represented by the Conservative Party. So in administrations run by the NDP, the Liberals, the Saskatchewan Party, and others, we have secret ballot certifications in provincially regulated workplaces right across this country. In Quebec, Canada's second most unionized province, there is enormous support for secret ballot votes on certification. One poll in August of 2009 found that 71% of Quebecers said secret ballots should be required as a way of getting union certification. In the United States, polls have shown 80% of people believe that a secret ballot should be required for a union to form. So it cannot simply be seen south of the border as a Republican or a Democratic issue. It is an issue that unites basically all North American public opinion in a vast majority who favor a secret ballot vote before a union can certify a workplace. And I would further identify the fact, Mr. Speaker, that if RCMP members are forced to join a particular union without having the chance to vote, that union will have difficulty establishing itself as a legitimate representative for the workers that for which it would become the bargaining unit. Now, Mr. Speaker, I also warn the government of a political problem, and that is the reality that if they do deny employees in the RCMP the ability to conduct a secret ballot vote on unionization, they could very well learn of stories of intimidation within the workplace, and those stories will reflect badly on the government's decision to strip that basic right from RCMP members. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask the government to consider an amendment to the legislation which would preserve the existing secret ballot formula that is found in public service labor relations legislation, and ensure that the people, the men and women who put on the uniform of the RCMP are given that basic human right in an eventual and inevitable certification drive, and that if they should select to unionize through that mechanism of a vote, then we nationwide should respect the result of that vote and respect the legitimacy of the union that it produces. Mr. Speaker, this is not a radical concept. We have 5 provinces in this country where provincially regulated workplaces certify their unions through secret ballot voting. It is a basic tenet of democracy. And you know, it's interesting, I think that deep down, members of the Liberal government understand and agree with that. I'll tell you why. Because I've listened to all of their comments with respect to their proposed repeal of Bill C-525. That's the bill that the Conservative government passed to create secret ballot voting rights. And you know the two words they never say when they're talking about that bill? You know the words they never utter? Two words: secret ballot. They say that that bill, now law, makes certification harder and decertification easier. But they don't say how. They say that it lowers unionization rates, but they don't say why. The bill really only does one thing. It replaces a card check petition with a secret ballot vote. But members of the government side can never actually bring themselves to utter those two words, secret ballot. Why? Because I think they know that if they were to openly argue against the right to vote for federally regulated workers on the grounds that it is not consistent with the government's view of labor relations, they would be laughed at out of any room in this country. Everybody, coast to coast, acknowledges that democratic decision-making has to happen through a secret ballot. In fact, Mr. Speaker, you are chosen by secret ballot. We choose representation for our very House through a secret ballot vote. Every single person in this room has a job today because they were elected by secret ballot. In fact, most unions elect their representatives through a secret ballot vote when they're certified. Everybody acknowledges that decisions of this magnitude made by a group of employees in a workplace should be done through a secret ballot unless one has an ideological motivation to override the real will of the working people and to impose an outcome on them. And Mr. Speaker, I think that you will find that in reality those who are pushing for an end to secret ballot voting within the workplace on matters of unionization are those who are unhappy with the outcome that secret ballot democratic vote would produce. That is no excuse, Mr. Speaker. You cannot oppose democracy simply because you do not like the outcome to which it leads. And that is why we, as official opposition, congratulate the government for C-7 in its own right as a fair and balanced approach to respond to the Supreme Court's ruling on collective bargaining in the RCMP, and ask them to make this bill a better bill through an amendment that would allow the brave men and women who wear the RCMP uniform to be the masters of their own destiny by giving them the right to vote. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Carleton for his comments, and especially for confirming that Bill 7 itself is reasonable, fair, constructive, and we do look forward to comments and suggest proposals at the committee level. But the member used most of his time to talk about Bill C-4 and to talk about Bill C-525 that his government put forward. And I'd like to remind the member that there was a huge amount of controversy and comment that Bill C-525 was pushed through without consultation. And in fact, and in contrast to Bill C-7, in which there was extensive consultation. So that's one point I want to make before I get to my question. The second is, if the member is so proud of Bill C-525, which would require a mandatory vote, why did the government hide the report that their very own department tabled, showing that a mandatory vote is detrimental to labour relations in comparison to the card check method? The card check method does enable the public service members to indicate their preference around being represented by an employee organization. So I find it stunning that given they hid the evidence that suggested their bill was a bad one, they never consulted on it, that this would be the key thing that the member would want to push for in this House. It just, it defies belief. So we have the NDP saying the card check's the only way.
Order. We're working on limited time here for questions and comments. The honourable member for Carleton.
The member says we should have consulted more on Bill C-525. The ultimate consultation is a secret ballot vote. And that's what Bill C-525 provided. It gave hundreds of thousands of employees in federally regulated workplaces the right to vote on whether or not they wanted to be represented by a particular union. I note that the member, again, was afraid to say those two terrifying words, secret ballot. She couldn't say them because she knows that her position and her government's position on this issue is totally untenable. What they revealed yesterday, they put out a report in which they said that unionization rates are not as high when workers get a chance to vote on the question. But that is not proof that they should have their rights stripped away from them. Just because workers don't vote the way Liberals and people on the union left want them to, doesn't mean they should lose the right to vote. Mr. Speaker, they have the right to, workers should have the right to vote because it is an inherent basic right that dates back hundreds of years in our parliamentary system of democracy, and we on this side of the House of Commons will keep standing up for that right.
Questions and comments. Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question to the member is, while he was in government, there was a decision made by the Supreme Court of Canada. Can he maybe provide some information to the House as to why he believes that there was no legislation brought in by the former government to deal with this issue, or at least there didn't appear to be any push from the government at the time to try to get this particular issue dealt with when they had the opportunity to do so?
Well, member for Carleton.
That's a fair question, Mr. Speaker. The ruling came out in January of 2015. Parliament rose in June of 2015, and that was the last time that this place convened before the election. And so in that brief interval of 4 or 5 months, it was not possible to properly consult RCMP members and police leaders in order to construct a legislative solution to that ruling. And that's evidenced by the fact that this government has been in office since November, and it's now mid-March, which means that they took some time in order to craft a response. And I think within the confines of the bill itself, notwithstanding the related bill of flawed Bill C-4, the government has done a decent job.